3 weeks. That's how long my HOA fee was overdue when they decided to teach me a lesson I'd never forget. I came back from my morning grocery run to find a crowd gathered at the marina. Thought maybe someone had a heart attack or something. Then I saw the crane truck, and the sledgehammers, and my beautiful second chance being systematically destroyed right there at the dock. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, pushing through the neighbors. "Emergency HOA action," Veronica Whitmore called down from her balcony, clipboard in hand like some bureaucratic executioner. "Delinquent fees, unsafe vessel removal." The sound of fiberglass cracking echoed across the water. 30 years of building this yacht with my own hands, demolished for $347. The diesel smell from the ruptured fuel tank made me sick. But Veronica had no idea what she'd just started. Sometimes the quiet guy has the biggest surprises. What would you do if your HOA declared war over late fees? Where are you watching from, dealing with your own HOA nightmare? Here's the thing about bullies. They always start small, testing your boundaries before they go nuclear. My name's Marcus Blackwell, and 3 years ago I made what seemed like the smartest decision of my life, buying the smallest condo at Sunset Harbor Marina in South Carolina. After 30 years in the Navy, I wanted peace, quiet, and a place to work on my boat without anyone asking questions about my business. The boat was everything to me. Second chance, 68 feet of hand-selected teak, and 30 years of weekend dreams. Every plank I'd chosen myself, every coat of marine varnish mixed during shore leave in whatever port we'd docked. The rich, woody scent of teak oil became my weekend meditation, the smell of building something beautiful instead of watching things get destroyed overseas. I paid cash for the condo, kept a low profile, minded my own business. Should have been perfect, right? Enter Veronica Whitmore. Picture every entitled, inherited wealth stereotype you've ever met, then give her a clipboard and the legal authority to fine people. At 48, Veronica didn't just live at Sunset Harbor. She owned it, at least in her mind. 3 generations of waterfront family money, and she made damn sure everyone knew their place in her little kingdom. The first time I noticed her watching me was move-in day. Not the friendly neighbor wave, but that calculating stare you give someone when you're deciding if they belong. I was unloading my toolboxes when I spotted her on her balcony, manicured nails clicking against her coffee mug like a metronome, studying me like I was some kind of science experiment. The trouble started innocently enough. 3 months in, I got my first violation notice. Excessive mechanical noise during quiet hours. My crime? Hand sanding my boat deck at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. The gentle rasp of sandpaper against wood, apparently disturbing her afternoon wine ritual. $75 fine. I paid it without complaint, figured it was just community living. Biggest mistake I could have made, showing weakness to a predator. See, Veronica had a problem with guys like me. Blue-collar background, worked with my hands, didn't show up to yacht club social functions where neighbors compared stock portfolios over champagne. While they discussed market trends, I was under my boat with a wrench and a beer, the texture of weathered dock planks familiar under my work boots while designer sandals clicked past overhead. What really ate at her was the mystery. She'd done her homework, discovered I'd paid cash, had minimal public records, kept to myself. In her twisted logic, I was either some kind of criminal or new money trying to infiltrate her precious circle of Southern aristocracy. The whisper campaign began around month 6. Her friends started their evening walks past my slip during maintenance time, phones out, documenting every tool placement and rope arrangement. Did you see how he stores his equipment? Is that even regulation? I heard him on the phone talking about acquisitions. What kind of business is he really running? Truth was, I was ordering engine parts from my mechanic, but paranoia transforms innocent conversations into conspiracy theories. Evening became my sanctuary time. The sound of halyards pinging against masts in the harbor breeze, that peaceful marina rhythm that reminded me why I'd chosen this place. Second Chance wasn't just a boat. She was my shrine to fallen comrades. Hand-carved memorial plaques lined her cabin walls, honoring Navy buddies who'd never made it home. This vessel was sacred space, where I could talk to ghosts and remember brotherhood before war changed everything. Veronica saw none of that humanity, of course. To her, I was just the oddball who didn't fit her community aesthetic, who needed managing, controlling, or preferably removing entirely. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. While she played queen of her little marina kingdom, collecting petty fines and enforcing arbitrary rules, she had no idea she was harassing someone who could buy and sell her entire world without blinking. But that revelation was months away. First, we had to survive Veronica's escalating campaign to make my life miserable. And trust me, she was just getting started. 2 weeks after the sanding incident, Veronica struck again, and this time, she brought backup. I'm installing solar panels on Second Chance's cabin roof one sunny Saturday morning when I hear the clip-clop of expensive heels on the dock. Veronica approaches with her clipboard army, 2 other board members trailing behind like nervous puppies. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwell," she calls out, voice dripping with fake politeness. "We need to discuss your unauthorized boat modifications." I look up from my screwdriver, genuinely confused. "Solar panels? They're perfectly legal, actually encouraged under South Carolina's renewable energy statutes." "Not without architectural review," she snaps, consulting her clipboard like it contains the 10 Commandments. "Any modifications to vessels in our marina require board approval and a $500 daily fine until compliance." The smell of heated fiberglass from the panels mixing with her overpowering perfume made my head spin. This woman was standing in my personal space, threatening my independence project over paperwork she'd never mentioned before. "I'll need to see that rule in writing," I said calmly. Her smile turned predatory. "Emergency HOA meeting Monday night. We'll be discussing maintaining community standards." She emphasized those last words like they were some kind of threat. After they left, I did what any smart sailor does. I researched the hell out of my position. Spent Sunday afternoon in the marina's dusty community center, digging through boxes of HOA documents. The stale coffee and vanilla air freshener couldn't mask the musty scent of rarely opened filing cabinets, and my fingers came away gray with dust from documents that clearly hadn't seen daylight in years. That's when I discovered something interesting. Our HOA bylaws were older than my boat, last updated in 1987 when Reagan was still president. Solar panels weren't even mentioned because they weren't commercially viable yet. I remembered reading somewhere during my military legal training that ambiguity in contracts always favors the party who didn't write them. But here's what really caught my attention. While cross-referencing documents with county records, I noticed the HOA's legal address was just a P.O. box. More digging revealed something that made my Navy logistics brain light up. They hadn't filed required annual reports with the state in 4 years. Back when I was handling base contracts, I'd learned that organizations operating without proper registration can't legally enforce anything. They become paper tigers. Monday night's emergency meeting was a masterclass in petty tyranny. Veronica had arranged the community center like a courtroom, herself presiding from behind a folding table, while about 15 residents scattered across plastic chairs that creaked every time someone shifted uncomfortably. The sound of her heels echoing off the walls as she paced made everyone nervous. "We can't let certain elements degrade our property values," she announced, eyes locked on me. "Today it's solar panels, tomorrow it could be anything. We have standards to maintain." During the coffee break, something unexpected happened. 3 residents approached me, people I'd barely spoken to before, but whose faces had been growing increasingly worried over recent months. First was the Henderson couple, Harold and Betty, both in their 70s. Harold's hands shook as he pulled me aside. "She fined us $200 because our grandkids left bicycles on our patio," he whispered. "Said it didn't meet aesthetic standards. We've lived here 30 years, watched this place grow from nothing." Then Jake Morrison, a young father with calloused hands like mine, joined our quiet huddle. "Apparently my fishing gear's an eyesore. She wants it stored inside, but my wife's allergic to the bait smell. Damned if we do, damned if we don't." Betty's voice cracked. "We built this community when it was just pilings and dreams. Now we're afraid to let our grandchildren visit." I felt something shift inside me. That protective instinct you develop in the military when you see civilians being terrorized by bullies. This wasn't just about my solar panels anymore. After the meeting, I made some calls to old Navy contacts who'd dealt with contractor fraud. Turns out Veronica's enforcement company, Seaside Compliance Solutions, had quite the reputation. F rating with the Better Business Bureau, lawsuits in 3 states for harassment and illegal fee collection. Veronica's response was swift and predictable. She escalated to daily inspections by Seaside Compliance, 2 guys in polo shirts walking the docks every morning at 8 a.m. with clipboards and cameras, photographing scuff marks, water spots, and rope placements like they were documenting crime scenes. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Neighbors started hurrying past each other instead of chatting. Kids stopped playing on the docks. The natural sounds of community life, laughter, conversation, the happy splash of someone jumping off their boat, gradually disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the scratching of pens on violation forms. But 30 years of military service had taught me something valuable. When someone declares war on you, the worst thing you can do is react emotionally, so I started my own quiet documentation, photographing the inspectors from my cabin window while beginning evening walks around the marina. Fear only works when people suffer alone. Time to change that dynamic. The gloves came off completely the following week when Veronica orchestrated what she called an emergency board meeting to deal with my ongoing defiance. I'm replacing a corroded fuel line on second chance when Jake Morrison comes running down the dock, waving a certified letter like it's on fire. "Marcus, you need to see this. They posted these on every door this morning." Bechir, the header, screamed emergency aesthetic protocols in bold letters that hurt to look at. New rule. Any boat modifications now required a $2,500 architectural review fee, plus monthly compliance monitoring until approval. The retroactive enforcement meant my solar panels suddenly carried a $15,000 penalty. The paper felt flimsy between my fingers, like the cheap copier stock government offices use when they're trying to intimidate people on the cheap. I had to admire Veronica's audacity. She was either completely ignorant of basic legal procedure or banking on me being too intimidated to fight back. That afternoon, I walked into the musty community center and made a formal request for all HOA meeting minutes from the past 5 years. South Carolina law guaranteed me this right as a property owner, something I'd learned during my Navy logistics days when dealing with base housing disputes. Veronica's face cycled through 3 shades of red when I made the request. "This is harassment," she sputtered, but the law was clear. She had 10 days to comply, no matter how much steam came out of her ears. When those minutes arrived, I spent an evening in my cabin with a pot of black coffee and a yellow legal pad, methodically documenting every irregularity. The sound of my pen scratching against paper, mixed with the gentle lapping of waves against Second Chance's hull as I uncovered a pattern that would have made my old JAG friends salivate. Meeting after meeting showed the same violations. Emergency votes with only 3 members present when 7 constituted the board, rubber stamping contracts without competitive bidding, authorizing urgent repairs that somehow always went to Coastal Construction Solutions. A quick internet search revealed Coastal Construction's owner, Richard Whitmore, Veronica's brother-in-law. $78,000 in emergency repairs over 2 years, every contract awarded without public bid. I remembered processing military contracts where this kind of self-dealing would have triggered federal investigations and criminal charges. Family members can't profit from board decisions without proper disclosure and competitive bidding, basic fiduciary duty that Veronica had apparently never heard of. The community was catching on too. Jake Morrison discovered that every single violation notice had been issued to residents who didn't attend yacht club social functions. Working-class families were systematically targeted while the wine and cheese crowd got free passes on identical infractions. The Henderson couple made the most heartbreaking discovery. That mandatory deck repair they'd been forced to pay $3,000 for? Harold quietly got a second opinion from an independent contractor. The work was purely cosmetic, overpriced by 300%, and the original wood had been perfectly sound. The burnt coffee smell in their kitchen told the story of sleepless nights spent reviewing receipts, trying to figure out how they'd been swindled by their own neighbors. Betty's hands shook as she showed me invoice after invoice, her voice breaking. "We trusted them, Marcus. 30 years of trust, and they stole from us." Veronica's counterstrike came within 48 hours. A cease and desist letter from Pemberton and Associates, Charleston's most expensive legal intimidation firm, arrived by courier. They accused me of harassing board members and implied my questionable financial background would be exposed if I continued my pattern of stalking behavior. The thick letterhead was designed to scare normal people into submission. Expensive lawyers throwing around words like criminal investigation and civil liability usually work on folks who can't afford to fight back. They'd picked the wrong target. I called Commander Sarah Arden, my old Navy JAG friend who'd transitioned to maritime law practice. When I described Veronica's tactics, she actually started laughing. That particular sound Arden makes when someone has just volunteered to become her next legal victim. "Marcus, you magnificent troublemaker," she said over our secure line. "You've just handed me the perfect HOA corruption case. These people have violated about 6 different state laws, and I'm going to enjoy teaching them the difference between community governance and organized crime." Chen offered to handle my case pro bono, partly from professional interest, mostly because she despised bullies who used legal paperwork to terrorize elderly couples and young families. Meanwhile, I kept attending public meetings with my digital recorder, documenting every procedural violation. The smooth plastic device in my shirt pocket captured Veronica's increasing desperation as she realized her paper empire was being systematically dismantled. The final straw came when she announced a $25,000 per unit special assessment for critical infrastructure and legal defense. The real message was clear: pay up or get out. I watched Harold Henderson's face crumple as he calculated whether his fixed income could survive Veronica's financial warfare. 30 years of building community memories, and now they might lose their home to fund a vindictive woman's legal bills. That night, staring at the memorial plaques in my cabin, I made a decision my fallen Navy buddies would have understood. Sometimes you stop taking defensive positions and start protecting people who can't protect themselves. Veronica's next move was so brazenly illegal, it almost felt like she was daring me to stop her. I'm replacing a frayed dock line on second chance, breathing in the familiar cocktail of salt air and marine varnish, when Derek Thompson comes swaggering down the pier like he's conducting a military inspection. Derek was Veronica's latest acquisition, 6'2" of private security wannabe who'd convinced her to create an $85,000 Marina security director position tailored specifically for his non-existent qualifications. "Morning, Marcus," he says, adjusting his ridiculous tactical vest while trying to sound official. "Got some paperwork for you regarding emergency slip reassignment." The document he handed me still warm from the printer, reeking of desperation and fresh toner. My slip was being temporarily relocated for essential maintenance to slip 47, the Marina's equivalent of Siberia. Exposed to weather, no electrical hookups, basically a floating parking lot designed to make my life miserable enough that I'd take my boat elsewhere. But here's where Veronica made her biggest tactical error yet. In her rush to punish me, she'd never bothered reading the fine print on my slip rental agreement. "Derek," I said, setting the paper down with the kind of calm that makes smart people nervous, "you might want to consult maritime law before you start moving people's property. Boat slip assignments are considered property rights under South Carolina statute." His cocky expression flickered. But Veronica said, "Veronica says a lot of things. Doesn't make them legal." That evening's emergency meeting was standing room only. Word had spread through the Marina's informal network that something big was happening, and residents packed the community center with an energy I hadn't felt since my Navy days before a major operation. Veronica called the meeting to order with her usual theatrical authority, but when she announced the new slip reassignment policy, I stood up with my own thick folder of documents. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice carrying that command presence you never really lose, "I think the board should understand the legal implications of what you're proposing." The sudden silence was so complete you could hear the building's air conditioning humming overhead. Even the chronic chair creakers held still. I read directly from my slip rental agreement. Long-term slip assignments constitute property rights under state maritime law and may only be modified for documented safety violations or with written consent of the slip holder. The color drained from Veronica's face as her expensive attorney started whispering urgent warnings in her ear. She'd been so focused on harassing me, she'd never actually reviewed the contracts her own HOA had signed 3 years ago. Then came the real revelation. My solar panels weren't just legal, they were specifically protected. Under South Carolina's renewable energy statutes, environmental improvements like solar installations qualify for both accessibility protections and state environmental incentives. Trying to force their removal could trigger federal civil rights violations. Her lawyer's whispers became increasingly frantic as he realized his client had been systematically violating state and federal law for months. The meeting exploded into chaos. Residents who'd been quietly enduring Veronica's harassment suddenly found their voices. The texture of community anger, so long suppressed, finally erupted in a wave of shared frustration. "This is about maintaining community standards," Mrs. Ashford protested, but her usual confidence was cracking. "Standards?" Jake Morrison shot to his feet, his calloused hands clenched with righteous anger. "What standards? Making elderly couples afraid to let their grandkids visit? Finding families for children's bicycles? This isn't community management, it's extortion." The sound of scraping chairs echoed through the room as neighbors literally chose sides. Some moved toward my section, others clustered defensively around Veronica's shrinking circle of supporters. That night, desperation drove Veronica to her most reckless move yet. Derek began security patrols, creeping around the marina after midnight with night vision equipment, photographing my boat and documenting imaginary violations. The soft click of his camera and the gentle creak of dock planks under his boots woke Jake's son, who watched the whole surveillance operation from his bedroom window. I let Derek continue his amateur spy games while documenting every trespassing incident. Military experience teaches patience. Sometimes the best strategy is letting your enemies expose their own crimes while you build an ironclad case. The psychological warfare escalated when Seaside Compliance arrived with fresh condemned signs for second chance, claiming emergency inspections had revealed structural violations. The signs smelled like rushed printing and legal desperation, but they still drew worried stares from passing neighbors. That's when I made my first real power play. One phone call to Commander Pete Torres brought federal authority roaring into our little marina war. Torres arrived in full Coast Guard dress uniform, official clipboard in hand, demanding to see Seaside Compliance's marine inspection credentials. They had none, just a basic property management license that gave them zero authority over boats. The federal override of their fake safety citation, conducted in front of half the marina with official radio chatter and everything, was poetry in motion. Derek scrambled to remove the fraudulent signs under federal supervision while Veronica watched her enforcement arm crumble from her balcony perch. But instead of retreating, she made the fatal mistake of attacking something sacred, military service itself. The call came at 3 a.m., jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. "Marcus, it's Sarah, we have a problem." My old JAG friend's voice carried that edge I remembered from emergency briefings. Veronica just tried to withdraw $85,000 from the HOA emergency fund. Bank flagged it for suspicious activity. I sat up in Second Chance's cabin, surrounded by my fallen comrades' memorial plaques, and realized the war had just escalated beyond personal harassment. She was looting the community's finances to fund her vendetta against me. "Time to show our cards," I said. 2 hours later, I stood in the conference room of Arden, Blackwell, and Maritime Associates, staring at documents that would shatter Veronica's world. The mahogany table held 15 years of carefully constructed business deals, but the folder marked Tidewater Holdings, Sunset Harbor Acquisition made my hands shake. "You ready for this conversation?" Sarah asked, her expression mixing professional pride with personal concern. The truth felt heavier than anchor chain. While Veronica had been playing queen of her little marina kingdom, collecting illegal fines and terrorizing elderly couples, she'd been unknowingly stealing from me. Every special assessment, every fraudulent charge, every dollar diverted to her brother-in-law's company had been taken from property I'd owned for 22 months. Tidewater Holdings purchased the master deed during COVID, Sarah explained, spreading acquisition documents across polished wood. "Previous owner was drowning in debt, couldn't make payments. You saved this place from foreclosure, Marcus. Quietly assumed the underwater mortgage, kept 68 families from losing their homes." The irony tasted bitter as salt water. I'd bought Sunset Harbor to protect it, planning gradual revelation once I'd earned the community's trust. Instead, I'd watched helplessly as the woman I'd been shielding terrorized the very people I'd sacrificed millions to save. "Why didn't you just reveal ownership immediately?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. "Virginia," I said simply. The memory still stung. $8 million lost when that waterfront community fought outside developer gentrification so viciously they destroyed themselves rather than accept help. Old money doesn't trust new money, especially when it comes with business cards and corporate entities. I'd learned that coastal communities respond to neighbors, not investors. My plan had been simple: live among them, prove I belonged, then gradually reveal the partnership that could transform their home into something extraordinary. Instead, I'd watched Veronica embezzle $247,000 through 6 shell companies while I paid the community's real bills from my own accounts. Deferred maintenance, insurance premiums, infrastructure repairs. I'd been subsidizing their lives while she stole their money. Rebecca Walsh's forensic analysis painted a picture of systematic theft spanning 3 years. Fake invoices, kickback schemes, emergency assessments that disappeared into offshore accounts. Under federal RICO statutes, Veronica faced decades in prison. "You have absolute power here," Sarah said, sliding foreclosure documents across the table. One signature and everyone goes. Clean slate, fresh start, no complications. The weight of that power felt suffocating. I could end this war instantly. Evict every resident, terminate every lease, rebuild Sunset Harbor as a luxury resort where men like Derek Thompson would never afford slip fees. But Harold Henderson's weathered hands teaching kids to tie proper boat knots, Jake Morrison's children playing safely on docks I'd been secretly maintaining, Betty Henderson's apple pies at community potlucks. These weren't complications to be eliminated. They were the reason I'd bought this place. Looking through the office windows at Charleston Harbor, I could see second chances massed in the distance, memorial plaques catching morning light. My fallen Navy buddies had died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. No, I said, pushing the foreclosure papers away. We do this right. Surgical strike against corruption, full protection for innocent residents. Time to stop being their secret guardian and start being their public leader. The look in Sarah's eyes told me she'd been hoping for exactly that answer. The smell of strong coffee and righteous anger filled Sarah's law office as we transformed her conference room into something between a military command center and a community healing circle. Harold Henderson sat hunched over boxes of documents he'd been saving for 30 years, his weathered hands sorting through meeting minutes and expense reports with the careful precision of a man who'd built half the marina with his own sweat. Never threw anything away, he said, voice thick with emotion. Betty always told me, you never know when you'll need proof of what really happened. Rebecca Walsh, our forensic accountant, spread Harold's documentation across the mahogany table like puzzle pieces that finally revealed the complete picture. This is incredible, she whispered, tracing financial patterns with her finger. She's been stealing from you people for 3 years, and Harold's records prove every single transaction. The money trail was breathtakingly brazen. Seaside Compliance collected HOA funds, transferred them to Coastal Construction Solutions, Veronica's brother-in-law's company, which then kicked back percentages to Derek's fake maritime security services. The final destination was always the same, accounts controlled by Whitmore Family Trust. Jake Morrison arrived with his laptop, still in his fishing clothes that carried the honest scent of salt water and hard work. Got those photos of the emergency repairs, he said, pulling up images of obviously cosmetic work. $3,000 to paint deck railings that were perfectly fine. My neighbor paid for Veronica's European vacation. Commander Torres joined our growing coalition via video link, his Coast Guard authority lending federal weight to our civilian rebellion. Maritime safety fraud is serious business, he said, reviewing Derek's fake inspection reports. 10-year minimum sentences when you falsify federal safety documents. But the real power in that room wasn't legal, it was emotional. Mrs. Arden, the elderly widow from Unit 12, sat quietly in the corner with a leather journal that contained 2 years of detailed harassment documentation. Every violation notice, every intimidation tactic, every time Veronica had made her afraid to use her own patio. I started writing everything down after the bicycle incident, she said softly. Watching Harold and Betty get terrorized, seeing Jake's children afraid to play outside. Someone needed to remember what really happened here. Sarah outlined our strategy while I watched these brave people transform from isolated victims into a united community. Criminal referrals to FBI White-Collar Crime Division. Civil RICO lawsuit seeking triple damages for the systematic theft. State Attorney General complaints about unlicensed business operations. Federal maritime violations for Derek's fraudulent inspections. She's going to fight dirty, Sarah warned, studying Veronica's psychological profile. Entitled narcissists don't surrender gracefully. Expect public meltdowns, character assassination attempts, maybe even threats. That's where my military experience became crucial. I'd seen desperate people make dangerous decisions when their world collapsed. Veronica would likely target the community's most vulnerable first, elderly residents who couldn't defend themselves, young families with everything to lose. The Community Protection Plan reflected lessons learned from 30 years of keeping civilians safe in hostile territories. Emergency fund established to cover all illegal assessments. Harold and Betty's financial stress eliminated immediately. Legal representation for every resident. Secure communication network so Veronica couldn't isolate witnesses. Safe housing arrangements if threats escalated to violence. Rebecca discovered something that made Harold actually smile for the first time all day. Seaside Compliance's liability insurance had lapsed 8 months ago, meaning every board member who approved their actions faced personal financial exposure. The Ashfords, Veronica's most reliable allies, would scramble to distance themselves once they realized their retirement accounts were vulnerable. The revelation planning felt like preparing for a military operation where the objective was healing rather than destruction. Community meeting in the Marina Pavilion, my property, though they didn't know that yet. Witnesses including local reporter Jennifer Walsh, state HOA ombudsman, federal representatives. Visual displays showing money trails and systematic corruption, but presented as community education rather than public humiliation. Harold pulled out a faded photograph from his document boxes. The Marina's groundbreaking ceremony 30 years ago, young families with small children, everyone hopeful about building something lasting together. "This is what we're really fighting for," he said, voice breaking slightly. "Not revenge against Veronica, we're fighting to get our home back." Jake nodded, thinking about his own children who'd stopped playing on the docks they'd once considered their backyard playground. "My kids should be learning to sail and fish, not walking on eggshells because some woman thinks she owns our happiness." As evening approached, our war room had evolved into something more powerful than legal strategy. It had become community reclamation. These weren't just residents anymore. They were neighbors who'd rediscovered their collective strength. I stood at the window watching Second Chance's mast catch the last sunlight, memorial plaques visible even from this distance. Tomorrow I'd stop being the hidden guardian and become the public leader these people deserved. The resources to protect them, the military training to ensure their safety, and most importantly, the community bonds that made fighting worthwhile. Sarah's final warning echoed in my mind. Once you reveal ownership, everything changes. Good. Change was exactly what Sunset Harbor needed. The federal investigation hit Veronica like a hurricane she never saw coming. I woke to the distant rumble of diesel engines and radio chatter echoing across the harbor. Through Second Chance's cabin window, I watched FBI vehicles surround the Seaside Compliance office while Coast Guard boats positioned themselves strategically around the marina. The smell of salt air mixed with exhaust fumes as federal agents executed simultaneous search warrants at dawn. Veronica's scream cut through the morning stillness as agents knocked on her door with boxes and badges. Her perfectly manicured world was being systematically dismantled by people who understood the difference between community leadership and organized crime. Derek was already in handcuffs by the time I'd finished my coffee, charged with false terrorism reporting, maritime fraud, and breaking and entering. The sight of him being perp-walked past the community center where he'd strutted around in his fake tactical vest felt like poetic justice with a federal badge. Within hours, every computer, every document, every financial record from Veronica's criminal enterprise was loaded into evidence trucks. The Ashfords stood on their balcony in bathrobes, watching their former allies' empire collapse in real time, suddenly very interested in distancing themselves from her illegal activities. But Veronica wasn't finished. Desperate cornered animals often attack their own pack, and she immediately started throwing former allies under the federal bus. Phone calls to her lawyer, frantically claiming she'd been manipulated by Derek, that the management company had deceived her about proper procedures. The community watched this meltdown with mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Harold Henderson stood on the dock with his morning paper, shaking his head as federal agents cataloged evidence. 30 years I've watched this place grow, he said to no one in particular. Never thought I'd see the day our HOA president got raided by the FBI. Jake Morrison's kids emerged from their self-imposed indoor exile, cautiously venturing onto docks they'd been afraid to play on for months. The sound of children's laughter mixing with federal radio chatter created a surreal soundtrack of liberation and justice. That afternoon brought Veronica's most desperate gambit yet. She called an emergency press conference on her balcony, dressed in her most expensive outfit, trying to control the narrative before it completely escaped her grasp. "This is a witch hunt against successful community leadership," she declared to the single local news camera that bothered showing up. "These federal agencies have been weaponized by a disgruntled resident who refuses to follow basic community standards." The irony was breathtaking. A woman facing federal embezzlement charges was claiming persecution while standing on a balcony overlooking the marina, where she'd terrorized elderly couples and young families for years. But her real target became clear when she started attacking my military service directly. "This Marcus Blackwell character has been plotting against our community from day one," she announced, her voice carrying that shrill edge of genuine panic. Military extremist with questionable mental health, using his connections to federal agencies to intimidate peaceful residents. Using veteran stereotypes and PTSD stigma as weapons was a tactical mistake that revealed just how little she understood about the community she'd been trying to control. Jake Morrison, whose father served in Desert Storm, took personal offense. Harold Henderson, whose brother died in Vietnam, felt his military family honor being attacked. Within hours, something beautiful happened. Veterans from surrounding communities started arriving at Sunset Harbor, not as intimidation, but as solidarity. Retired Navy families, Coast Guard veterans, Marine Corps reservists, all coming to support one of their own against a woman who'd made the fatal error of questioning military service integrity. The sight of dress uniforms gathering at the Marina Pavilion while federal agents continued processing evidence created an atmosphere of dignity that completely overshadowed Veronica's increasingly desperate accusations. That evening, I received a visit that changed the entire emotional landscape of our conflict. A delegation led by Harold and Betty Henderson knocked on Second Chance's hull, carrying something I hadn't expected, an invitation. "We're organizing a Veterans Appreciation Dinner," Betty said, her voice strong despite months of harassment-induced stress. "Community's way of saying thank you, and showing that woman exactly where we stand on her attacks against military families." The invitation was handwritten on Marina stationery, signed by every family Veronica had terrorized. Jake Morrison's kids had drawn little boats in the margins. Mrs. Arden had added a note in careful script: "Heroes protect communities. Thank you for protecting ours." Standing there in the gathering twilight, holding an invitation that represented everything Veronica had tried to destroy, community solidarity, mutual respect, shared values, I realized the war was already over. She just didn't know it yet. Federal agents had seized her financial weapons. Her community had rejected her psychological warfare. Her former allies were scrambling for legal protection. Tomorrow's revelation would simply make official what tonight had already accomplished. Sunset Harbor belonged to the people who'd built it with their own hands and hearts, not to bullies who tried to rule it through fear and theft. The smell of barbecue smoke drifted across the water as neighbors prepared for a celebration Veronica would never understand. The joy of people who'd rediscovered their home. Friday morning brought the kind of federal attention that turns small-town corruption into national headlines. The sound of helicopter rotors woke the entire marina as FBI financial crimes specialists descended on what remained of Veronica's crumbling empire. I watched from Second Chance's deck while agents in windbreakers carried out boxes of evidence that would put her away for decades. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades mixed with the gentle lapping of waves created a soundtrack of justice that felt almost musical. Veronica's desperate phone calls to expensive lawyers had yielded the kind of advice that wealthy criminals hate hearing. Cooperate fully, hope for reduced sentencing, and pray the federal prosecutors were feeling merciful. Her personal assets, luxury cars, jewelry, even her prized yacht, were already under federal seizure orders. The Ashfords received federal subpoenas that morning, delivered by polite agents who explained their potential liability as co-conspirators in a RICO enterprise. Mrs. Ashford's breakdown was visible from 3 balconies away, 30 years of social status evaporating as she realized their retirement accounts might be liquidated to pay restitution to embezzlement victims. By noon, both Ashfords were knocking on my cabin door, still in their bathrobes, begging for help they'd never needed before. "We had no idea, Mrs." Ashford sobbed, her previous arrogance replaced by genuine terror. "Veronica told us everything was legal, that you were the problem." The transformation was remarkable. 2 people who'd spent months supporting harassment campaigns were suddenly faced with federal prosecutors who didn't care about yacht club social rankings or inherited family money. Criminal liability has a way of clarifying moral priorities. Jake Morrison's wife brought me coffee that afternoon, her children playing freely on the docks for the first time in months. "They're not afraid anymore," she said, watching her daughter practice casting a fishing line. "Whatever you did, however you made this happen, thank you." But Veronica wasn't finished fighting. Cornered narcissists often become most dangerous when their world completely collapses, and she spent Friday afternoon making increasingly desperate calls to anyone who might still take her seriously. Her final gambit was pure psychological warfare, a last-ditch attempt to turn the community against me before I could speak publicly. She started spreading rumors that I was a federal informant who'd infiltrated Sunset Harbor specifically to entrap innocent neighbors in some kind of elaborate sting operation. The social media posts were particularly vicious. Photos of federal agents at the marina with captions about military extremists using government connections to destroy peaceful communities. Claims that I'd been planning this assault on community governance for years. The irony was breathtaking. A woman facing 20 years in federal prison was accusing me of being too connected to law enforcement. Her accusations might have worked in a different community, but she'd made the fatal error of attacking military veterans in a harbor full of military families. Harold Henderson, whose brother died in Vietnam, took personal offense at implications that military service equated to federal conspiracy. Jake Morrison's father drove down from Colombia that evening, bringing 3 other Gulf War veterans who'd heard about Veronica's attacks on military integrity. The sight of dress uniforms gathering at the Marina Pavilion sent a clear message about where the community's loyalties lay. That evening brought my moment of decision. Harold and Betty Henderson knocked on Second Chance's hull, carrying an invitation that changed everything about how I'd planned to reveal my ownership. "Veterans Appreciation Dinner tomorrow night," Betty said, her voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "Community's way of saying thank you and showing that woman exactly where we stand." The invitation was handwritten on Marina stationery, signed by every family Veronica had terrorized. Jake's kids had drawn boats in the margins. Mrs. Arden had added a note in careful script, "Heroes protect communities. Thank you for protecting ours." Standing there holding that invitation, I realized the revelation I'd been planning no longer mattered. The community had already chosen sides, already decided who belonged and who didn't. My ownership of the marina was just paperwork compared to the relationships I'd built with people who'd become family. But Veronica made one last desperate play that forced my hand completely. That night, she attempted to access the HOA's remaining emergency funds, $43,000 that legally belonged to the residents she'd been stealing from for years. The bank's fraud alert system triggered automatically, sending notifications to federal investigators and myself as the actual property owner. Watching her try to steal money while under federal investigation for embezzlement was like watching someone dig their own grave while standing in it. Sarah called at midnight with news that would end Veronica's war permanently. She just violated her bail conditions. They're picking her up in the morning. Looking out at the peaceful marina, lights reflecting off calm water while federal agents maintained discreet surveillance, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not victory, something better. The satisfaction of protecting people who'd become worth protecting, of building something that couldn't be destroyed by bullies with clipboards and inherited money. Tomorrow would bring revelations, explanations, and new beginnings. Tonight brought something simpler. The sound of children's laughter echoing across water where they finally felt safe to play. Saturday evening transformed the Marina Pavilion into something between a town hall meeting and a celebration of justice served. News vans lined the parking area while federal agents maintained discreet positions around the perimeter. The smell of Barbara Henderson's apple pie mixed with salt air and the nervous energy of a community ready to reclaim its identity. Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 adjusted her microphone as State HOA Ombudsman Patricia Arden reviewed her notes, both preparing to document what promised to be the most dramatic community meeting in South Carolina history. I stood at the back of the pavilion, watching neighbors fill folding chairs with an energy I hadn't felt since military briefings before successful missions. Jake Morrison's kids played on the dock below, their laughter providing a soundtrack of normalcy that made everything feel worth fighting for. The crowd fell silent when Harold Henderson stood to address the gathering, his weathered hands steady on the microphone. 30 years ago, we built this place with dreams and sweat equity, he began, his voice carrying across water that reflected evening lights. Tonight, we take it back from people who tried to steal both. That's when I stepped forward, carrying the documents that would change everything. Before we continue, I said, my voice finding that command authority you never really lose, there's something I need to tell everyone about who really owns this marina. The silence was so complete you could hear waves lapping against dock pilings. Jennifer Walsh's camera operator zoomed in as I opened the folder containing Tidewater Holdings acquisition documents. My name is Marcus Blackwell, and for the past 22 months, I've been the legal owner of every dock, every slip, every inch of water you call home." The collective gasp was audible. Betty Henderson's hand flew to her mouth. Jake Morrison's eyes went wide. Even the federal agents looked surprised at the scope of the revelation. "I bought Sunset Harbor during COVID to prevent foreclosure," I continued, scanning faces that showed everything from shock to understanding to relief. "Previous owner was drowning in debt. You were 68 families away from losing your homes, and nobody knew it was happening." Mrs. Ashford, free on bail but facing federal charges, chose that moment for her final desperate performance. She burst into the pavilion with her high-powered attorney, demanding the right to respond to what she called an elaborate fraud scheme designed to destroy community governance. "This man," she pointed at me with shaking hands, "has orchestrated everything. The federal investigation, the media attention, the systematic destruction of legitimate HOA operations. He's been planning this takeover for years." The attorney tried to control his client, but desperation had made her reckless. "You've all been manipulated by a military extremist with federal connections," she continued, her voice rising to near hysteria. "This entire investigation is revenge against proper community standards." That's when Harold Henderson stood up again, his voice carrying 30 years of community authority. "Proper standards," he said, his words cutting through her accusations like a blade. "You mean fining elderly couples for grandchildren's bicycles, terrorizing families over fishing equipment, stealing our money to fund your family's construction company?" Jake Morrison rose beside him. "My kids were afraid to play on their own docks because of your standards. This man," he gestured toward me, "gave them their childhood back." Jennifer Walsh stepped forward with her microphone, seizing the journalistic moment. "Mr. Blackwell, if you've owned this property for nearly 2 years, why reveal it now?" "Because some things matter more than business privacy," I replied, looking across faces that had become family. These people were being systematically robbed and terrorized by their own HOA. When bullies attack your neighbors, you stop hiding and start protecting. FBI agent Richardson chose that moment to provide the evening's final dramatic punctuation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he announced, stepping into the pavilion with federal authority, "you're under arrest for violation of bail conditions and additional counts of embezzlement." The perp walk happened in full view of news cameras and the entire community she'd terrorized. Veronica Whitmore, once the self-appointed queen of Sunset Harbor, was led away in handcuffs while neighbors she'd spent years harassing watched in satisfied silence. Patricia Arden from the state ombudsman's office took the microphone as federal agents departed. "This case will become a model for HOA fraud prosecution statewide," she announced. "Mr. Blackwell's documentation and this community's courage have exposed systematic corruption that threatened dozens of families." The evening's emotional climax came when Betty Henderson approached the microphone with tears streaming down her face. "Marcus," she said, her voice breaking, "you saved our home. You saved our community. You saved us when we couldn't save ourselves." The applause started slowly, building to something that felt like thunder rolling across the harbor. Jake's children ran up from the docks, joining their parents in celebration of something they were too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel: the return of safety to their world. Standing there in front of cameras and neighbors and federal agents, I realized the anonymous guardian phase of my life was permanently over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, community leadership responsibilities, and the kind of public accountability I'd spent 3 years avoiding. Tonight brought something better: the sound of a community that had rediscovered its voice. The sound that woke me this morning wasn't federal helicopters or angry HOA presidents. It was children laughing as they raced their toy boats across the harbor. From Second Chance's deck, I watched Jake Morrison's 8-year-old daughter teaching her younger brother proper sailing knots, the same ones Harold Henderson had patiently shown her during our first community sailing lesson. The smell of Betty Henderson's cinnamon rolls drifted from the pavilion where she was preparing for another monthly potluck, baking without fear of violation notices for unapproved cooking aromas. Veronica Whitmore's federal sentencing had concluded 3 weeks ago with the kind of justice that restores your faith in the system. 12 years in federal prison, $2.4 million in restitution, complete asset forfeiture. Her former yacht club friends had publicly disavowed her during the trial, social climbing proving as fragile as the criminal enterprise she'd built on stolen community funds. The transformation of Sunset Harbor had exceeded every dream I'd harbored during those dark months of harassment and surveillance. Property values increased 30% through genuine improvements, upgraded electrical systems, expanded dock space, environmental restoration that earned us certified wildlife habitat status, the kind of development that enhanced lives instead of threatening them. Our community had unanimously elected me marina manager with 2-year terms, full financial transparency, and monthly town halls where anyone could question every expenditure. The military logistics training that once managed naval facilities now coordinated civilian paradise, minus the bureaucratic nightmares that made military life frustrating. Harold Henderson had become our official historian, leading newcomer orientations with stories about families who built this place through weekend labor and shared sacrifice. His weathered hands still showed calluses from 30 years of dock construction, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned his place through honest work rather than inherited privilege. The youth sailing program had grown into my personal mission, teaching 40 local children the water safety and seamanship skills their parents had been too terrified to let them learn during Veronica's reign of surveillance. Jake's son earned his sailing certification last month, confidence replacing the anxiety that had kept him prisoner indoors for nearly a year. The veterans on the water therapy program brought healing that extended far beyond my original intentions. Monthly gatherings for fishing trips, boat maintenance workshops, and the kind of brotherhood that helped process experiences civilian communities rarely understood. Second Chance's memorial plaques had expanded to honor veterans from across the region, transforming my private shrine into community sacred space. 3 neighboring marinas had adopted our governance model after witnessing how resident-controlled management could revolutionize waterfront living. The movement was spreading, communities discovering their collective power to eliminate predatory management companies and protect vulnerable members from bureaucratic bullies. Mrs. Arden's community garden flourished on land that once hosted Veronica's compliance office, growing vegetables families shared during potlucks. Perfect symbolism, community nourishment blooming where community harassment had festered. The Ashfords had quietly departed after their federal plea bargain, selling to a young Coast Guard family whose twin toddlers immediately joined our sailing program. Sometimes the best resolution involves toxic people removing themselves from communities where they never belonged. Harold and Betty Henderson celebrated their 32nd year here by renewing wedding vows at the pavilion where federal agents had once arrested their tormentor. Their grandchildren served as flower girls, playing safely on docks their grandparents had helped construct decades earlier. Tonight's sunset painted the harbor gold while Jake's kids practiced knot tying and their parents planned weekend fishing expeditions. Standing on Second Chance's deck, surrounded by memorial plaques that caught the dying light, I felt something military service had never provided. The deep satisfaction of protecting a community that had genuinely become worth every sacrifice. My fallen Navy buddies would have approved of this mission's conclusion. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought overseas. They happen in neighborhoods where families build homes and children learn that good people will always protect them from bullies. Speaking of bullies, I know you've got your own HOA horror story brewing in your neighborhood. Drop it in the comments below because trust me, every community has its petty tyrant with a clipboard, and someone needs to document these power-drunk lunatics before they destroy more lives. The wildest story might just become our next investigation. And if watching justice get served with a side of community healing made your day a little brighter, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We're hunting down more David versus Goliath stories where ordinary people discover they're stronger than the bullies trying to crush them. Because sometimes, the quiet guy with the boat has the biggest surprises.